Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Tips and Tricks with me, Joshua Snow, and today I've got a video for you that's a little bit more on the creative side, and this video is about creating what's known as the Orton Effect. Now, back in the day when it was created, it was basically two negative film images, one blurry and overexposed, one sharp and perfectly exposed, kind of sandwiched together to create a very, very soft image. In today's world, obviously with digital photography and Photoshop and Lightroom, we have many different tools that we can use to achieve a very similar look. Now, this is one of those more creative techniques that some of the more purist photographers might not love, but I personally love how it can sort of tie an image together, create this really ethereal effect, and there's all kinds of other add-on things that you can sort of do to help enhance and refine this technique to kind of suit your taste. So without further ado, we're going to get right into the video. All right, everyone, here we are in Lightroom, and I have one of my favorite images of all time, taken at Mount Rainier National Park a few years ago. The title of this image is Beyond. It is my best-selling print by a long shot. This was an incredible evening that I hiked up to this vantage point along Pinnacle Peak with some friends. More like a bushwhack. And I have always wanted to photograph these pasque flowers in their seed stage. This is when they are kind of like dandelions. The flowers have faded. Now the seeds are all fuzzy and beautiful, and eventually they will kind of fall off and blow around in the wind and be deposited somewhere to grow more flowers. But when they're in this stage, they just catch the light in such a beautiful way. It's the only image I have of these flowers, and I was so excited to finally see some when we hiked up here. But I won't waste too much of your time. Today, I'm going to show you how to create the Orton effect. Now, I sort of explained what that is a little bit. In today's world, and at least in my workflow, it is used to sort of tie an image together, to soften highlights, to create this beautiful glowy effect in the highlights. It helps create some depth. It helps create some separation in terms of softness. We've got crispy details in the shadows and in the foreground, and then as things kind of get further away and a little bit brighter, they get a little bit more of this effect in the way that we apply it in this tutorial. So I'm going to show you how we do this in both Lightroom and in Photoshop. I always end my workflow in Photoshop, and this is something I sort of do at the very end of a workflow. That's not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes this happens a couple of times throughout the image to kind of get the look that I'm after, but in general, I kind of do this at the very end. And if you're watching this, I have a free action for you down in the description that you can download, and then you can run this in Photoshop at the very end of your workflow, and it'll create the layers for you, it'll create the mask for you, and then you'll be able to do all of the finishing touches that you want to do, kind of tweaking the things within that action. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just immediately go and grab a selective adjustment tool. Now, I've already done a bunch of stuff to this image. You can obviously tell it may have even already had a small round of this Orton effect somewhere along the workflow. I did try to break it down to the point to right where I added the Orton effect right before that, so we can actually see what it's doing to pixels that haven't been blurred yet. You can see that I really have pushed the highlights here. You can look at the histogram and see that it is completely spread out from end to end and really bring in a lot of contrast to the image. So the highlights are already kind of there at their maximum point already, almost. So this could be taken as far or as little as you want. It's really personal taste, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how I do it. I don't usually do it here in Lightroom, but it's very simple and straightforward. We're going to go ahead and we're going to just grab a linear gradient tool. Now, you could do this with a brush, you could do this with a radial gradient. The whole point is that you're going to encompass the entire image here, and we're just going to go ahead and start dragging our linear gradient. We're just going to take this all the way down until it's basically out of the image, so that we know 100% of that image is covered by this gradient. And that, again, this is the whole point. You could do this with a brush tool. You could do this with a radial gradient. You just want to make sure that the entire image has this red overlay on it at this stage. Now the next stage, we're not going to add, we're not going to subtract. What we're going to do is intersect this with a luminance range. And we are essentially going to remove the shadows from this selection. Glow doesn't really happen in shadows, right? Like this is something that happens when in real life, maybe you've got some misty, foggy moisture in the atmosphere that is being intensified by light hitting it. So the whole point of this is that it enhances highlights and sort of creates this beautiful glowy effect. Think 80s glamour. So we're going to go ahead and now start removing the dark tones from this gradient. And we're just going to kind of take this until we just start to see a little bit of that sky creep in. And if we look at this, even without spreading this out at all to really help smooth out those edges of that selection, we can see that it does a really good job of isolating those brighter portions. So we're just going to kind of drag these along until we see those shadow bits in a large portion of the foreground not covered in that red overlay anymore. And that tells us that the effect will not be applied there. So now that we've got that selection accurate and this mask looking good, we can then come down here and potentially raise our exposure slightly. We can add some contrast back in. We can even warm up these highlights, which is something I like to do. It kind of gives this warm glow. If this was something I was doing to a night image or a twilight image, maybe I'd be taking this toward the cooler side. But maybe we can even add in a little bit of magenta, a little bit more warmth, maybe even a little saturation. And then we can come down here to effects and we can take out some of the clarity. And this is where the softening is going to come into play. Clarity is sort of like contrast. And so wherever the red overlay was in these highlights, those areas are essentially getting softened now. We're kind of removing some of the finer level contrast, because we did add some contrast back in because we want to kind of maintain that saturation as we brighten things. But then down here under effects, we're kind of just taking some of that sharpness away and allowing things to sort of bleed out and glow a little bit. We can even take a little texture away and a bunch of dehaze away. And if we just toggle our backslash key, we can see the before and the after, and just how much color and brightness and life that's sort of brought into the image and created this beautiful warm glow, which again can sort of tie an image together. It can help harmonize a color scheme, and it can really add a nice amount of depth and really bring an image to life. So that's how we would create this here in Lightroom. It's very, very simple. I love the effect. And now we can hop over into Photoshop and see how we do it there. All right, everybody, we're over here in Photoshop now, and I've got my thumbnail here in the layer stack. And the first thing we're going to do is duplicate that twice by hitting Command or Control J 2 times. And that's going to create 2 copies of that layer for us. Now we're going to rename this top one Sharp, Sharpened, or Sharpen, whatever you prefer. We're going to change this lower one to Blur. And so we have these 2 layers. And what we're about to do is essentially separate the lower frequency data, the colors and tones, from the high frequency data, the textures, the edges, and all the sharp details. And so we can take those colors and tones and sort of blur them and create this softness by the darks and the lights sort of bleeding together, the colors sort of bleeding into each other. And that's what kind of creates this blurry effect. And then we use a sharpened layer, a transparent sharpened layer, using the high pass sharpening method to help maintain the sharpness in all of those high frequency details. So that's how we maintain a nice sharp, clear image while getting this beautiful soft ethereal glow that sort of plays a trick on the eyes. So over here in Photoshop, we have our sharp and our blurred image. We're going to go ahead and take the sharpened layer, and we're going to come up to filter. We're going to select other, high pass, and I'm on a Sony a7R IV. I like to use a radius of about 1.5 for this. One will probably work. Two will probably be a little too sharp. The whole point here is that when you're done with this effect, it's about as sharp as it was before you did the effect, but there's this overall general softness. So I'm just aiming for a radius that through experience sort of keeps that sharpness about where it's at before we do the effect. So 1.5, we're going to hit OK. We're going to come over here to that layers blend mode, and we're going to change it to soft light. And then all of a sudden, it just looks the same. If we zoom into 100% and we just look at any area of detail here, let's look at this stuff back here, and I turn that off and on, you should see an increase in sharpness when it turns back on. You should. Now, we are zoomed in at 100%. I could go in again to 200%, and then you'll definitely see it's also enhancing any grain or texture or noise that's in there. This image maybe even could benefit from a little tiny bit of noise reduction, but I don't mind a little bit of noise. It helps enhance textures and it sort of gives the details a little bit more structure. So I don't mind a little bit of noise like this. And so I'm not worried about this. 1.5 pixels on the radius for the high pass seems to be about perfect. Now we're going to go down to this blurred layer, and we're going to go again to filter, except we're going to go to blur and then Gaussian blur. Now, this number, I have heard everything from 10 to 60. I've been using a radius of around 45 or 50 ever since I was using a 12 megapixel Nikon camera. And so I tend to just kind of start at 45. And the whole goal here is that you're essentially just obliterating the detail. It's like if you really had the need for glasses and you were not wearing them, this is what the image should look like. It looks like you need your glasses on. So I'm going to go ahead and just say OK at 45. And now we have our two images. Now, if I zoom in again to 200% here, you should see this weird overlay. That's from the high pass sharpening layer, and that's sort of confined to the edges of things. The detail, you'll notice it more in the areas that have a lot of texture going on. And so there we have our sharp layer and our blur layer, and we're ready to move on. The next thing we have to do is take this blur layer and just reduce the opacity. We don't need it to be that blurry. I like to take it down to about 25 or 30 to start with and just kind of see where we're at. If we zoom out and I simply group these together, which we're going to do anyway, I'm going to just name this Orton, and I turn this on and off, you should see the nice softening effect without a real change in color or tone, because we haven't done anything with that yet. We can open up this group here and we can say, hey, I want to brighten these highlights and warm these highlights up. There's all kinds of tools we can use. If we want to brighten things up, we can just take a brightness contrast adjustment using our little clipping tool, and we can brighten things up, and we can add a little bit of contrast, and that helps again keep that saturation. And so there we brightened things up a little bit. Maybe we want to warm up or saturate things. Well, we can open up our hue saturation adjustment, grab our clipping tool, and we can saturate whatever is happening. Now, what if we want to warm it up? Take a color balance adjustment layer, and on the highlights, we can just add a little bit of yellow, add a little bit of red, and there we have a bit of warmness happening. So underneath that sharpened layer, we've got all three of these different adjustments clipped to that blurred layer, and that's allowing all of those areas of blur to be affected by those layers, but the sharpness layer is unaffected. Now, that's sort of happening everywhere. We haven't done anything to filter this out of the shadows, and that's where a luminosity mask comes in. If we come over here to channels and we simply hold Command or Control, we click on our RGB channel, this will generate a selection that is identical to a Lights 1 luminosity mask if you're familiar with any sort of luminosity making panel. If we simply come down here to our channel masking button at the very bottom of our channels palette and click, that will create a black and white copy of that RGB channel. And this is what is essentially a Lights 1 mask. If we hit Command or Control D, that'll deselect those marching ants. And now we have an exact copy of the RGB channel. And again, identical to a Lights 1 luminosity mask. And you can see that if we keep in mind white reveals, black conceals, that a lot of the shadows are already filtered out of this. Now, we can adjust this mask if we want by simply holding Command or Control and clicking on L. We can bring up a levels adjustment and we can make the shadows darker and less selected. We can make the highlights more selected. Now, I don't think we need to do that necessarily, but we could if we needed to. Maybe I'll just bring in this black slider a little bit to help darken up some of these shadows to make sure that none of this effect is filtered into those shadows. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Reselect our Alpha 1 mask by holding Command or Control, making sure our RGB channel is turned on, or else we will have this weird red overlay. Turning that alpha mask off. And this seems way more complicated than the Lightroom version. But if you're familiar at all with Photoshop, or you're good with keyboard shortcuts and you're proficient at Photoshop at all, this should be a real breeze. Now, again, I'm going to make an action for this so that you literally only have to hit the play button and it'll do all of this stuff for you. Then you can simply go in and do your tweaks at the end. Okay, so you can see we have those marching ants again. We could just come over here and place that down as a mask. Now, if we highlight that, you can see that it's exactly the selection that we just had over in the channels. And this is now filtering everything that's within that group to those highlights. So it does not appear in the shadows. So it obviously takes a lot of that effect down because it's being filtered out of a large tonal group within the image. And so now you can go back in and you can either increase opacity of the blurred layer, you can increase any of the amounts in any of your adjustment layers. But in general, that is the Orton effect in Photoshop. And again, you can take this as far as you want. You can make it as glowy as you want, as warm, as colorful, as saturated as you want. But that is how I create the Orton effect in my workflow. And again, I do this kind of at the very end, just kind of help homogenize things and bring it all together. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you picked up some fun tricks in there, and maybe you'll use this in your workflow and you'll really enjoy how it looks. Thanks again for watching, and if you found some value in this video, please like, subscribe, and share with your community, and I'll see you on the next video.